Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Meishan Edge podcast, where we highlight the unique advantages of the Meishan pig, and we've got a good one for you today. Jonathan and I are here to talk with Dr. Tim Safranski, who is the swine specialist at the University of Missouri. We've got a list of questions for him and can't wait to hear more. Again, I'm Laura Jensen. I'm the president of the AMBA, and I wear a few other hats with Meishan Preservation and Jensen Reserve. Jonathan, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Jonathan Kemmerer. I'm the head of research for the Breed Association, and I run Odd Bird Farm in Northwest Missouri.
All right, cool. And Tim, as you would prefer to be called, would you like to say anything else on the introduction or add anything to it?
No, I'm excited to be able to talk to you. I've worked with all breeds of swine for a long time, and I do research, extension, and teaching, and serve on boards with the Missouri Pork Association, the Livestock Conservancy, and have followed the Meishan since their importation into the United States in 1989.
Sweet. Well, it is an honor to have you with us today. Thank you for taking time out to be
Absolutely.
on the podcast. Yeah. All right. Well, Jonathan, I know that you put together a great list of questions. You want to jump in and let's go.
So we haven't mentioned so far, Tim's specialty is in swine reproductive health, and so that's kind of what we want to talk about today. And I figured he would be, familiar with the Meishan because that was a big part of the reason for their importation. So I think to start with, it would be great to talk about a little bit about what makes them different than other breeds. What are the things that are unique about their reproductive organs and all of that?
Sure. So the history of importation, there was actually 3 Chinese breeds imported into the U.S. in 1989. And they went to 3 different land grants. And the idea was to understand what makes them so reproductively fit. And I'm sure the genetics folks, really were hoping, hey, we can make all the breeds do this or that because they're known for high reproductive performance. And the Meishan in particular was known for large litter size. Okay? And so of those 3 breeds, the Meishan is the only one that I'm aware of really having a population still in the U.S. So once they left those experiment stations, they were picked up, by some breeders and some genetic companies actually to study. And so there's a lot of information learned in kind of the late 80s, early 90s about what makes this breed different. And if you want to really nerd out, we can get into the scientific literature and read those journal articles. But the take home is, so they do have large litters. And a lot of that's due to embryo survival. And a lot of that, so the size of the uterus is a limitation to litter size. So every piglet has its individual placenta. And if its placenta is that big, you can fit more pigs than if it's that big. And what the comparisons were that the Meishan piglet has a smaller placenta. And so it's a fully formed, mature pig. It has a lighter birth weight. So when we have a piglet with our kind of conventional breeds that's less than 2 pounds, we struggle to see that as a full value pig. Whereas with the Meishan, that's a full value pig, right? So they're fully developed. Their brain, their intestines, their livers, everything that they're meant to be that size. One of the ways that they get by in a smaller placenta is that they have more vascularity in the placenta. And so the Iowa State group kind of teased that out and looking at the number of blood vessels, the proportion of the placenta that was represented by blood vessels. Some of the other kind of nerdy, interesting stuff they did was embryo transfers. And when they put Western breeds into Chinese pigs and Chinese embryos into Western pigs, some of those placental differences maintain themselves. And so a lot of that is the piglet itself that directs that.
So, Tim, were you, I'm not sure how to ask this the best way. Were you doing your line of work with the University of Missouri at the same time that these 3 research herds were working?
How old do you think I am?
I am not answering that, sir.
So I started my master's degree. I grew up in Oregon and actually had Hereford hogs for a while back there. But I started graduate work. I wanted to learn more about pigs. And so I started my graduate program actually at the University of Missouri in January of 1988.
Okay.
And so I was here. Those pigs came to the University of Illinois, Iowa State University, and University of Nebraska, but housed at the Meat Animal Research Center, which is a USDA center in Clay Center, Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
So I finished my PhD in 1994, and I did a postdoc at the Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska. I wasn't able to actually work with those pigs. That wasn't what I was hired to do. But so I was there, watching a lot of that research really throughout my graduate era. And about the time I was finishing, that was about the time the bulk of the lab research was finishing as well, because kind of it answered the major questions, and there's still a few around. I think I don't know. I think one of those stations still has some Meishan pigs.
Nice. Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So,
Sure.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, that's some cool pig nerd stuff. Absolutely.
So you mentioned one thing about the development, and it did kind of remind me. I remember coming across something that said that the piglets themselves were born with a more advanced digestive system.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? Does that mean they start eating food at a younger age, or what are the implications of that?
I don't know that anybody's really done that work to say how early can they begin eating or digesting things besides milk.
Mm-hmm.
But really, the Meishan digestive system is different throughout life. And so they have the ability, their digestive system has the ability to more efficiently digest ingredients that largely pass through more conventional pigs. And so they tend to, and it's part of the history, right? They were selected on more primitive diets, I guess you could call them. And so that's how they tend to perform. I'm not familiar with it, with anybody. So the big issue with commercial pigs and ingredient digestion young is soybean meal. So soybean meal is one of the most affordable protein sources available, but it has promotes allergic responses in very young pigs. I don't know if that's true of the Meishan.
Interesting.
Then as the pig grows, the bigger differences are their ability to digest things like fiber in more effective ways.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense, because I've seen people suggest using fish meal in early pig diets. Is that the reason?
Yeah, so the animal proteins are a lot more easily digestible. And so you'll see whatever animal protein is available. And I'll tell you a little anecdote. I did a workshop in Vermont, and it was an organic farming conference, and they asked me to do an 1.5-hour workshop. And at the time, we had a lot of conventional pigs being weaned at 14 to 16 days of age to try to get them away from their mother while they had colostral immunity and before they had contracted the disease. So it was the segregated early weaning was the technique. And it was much better for those baby pigs if we learned how to feed them right. And somebody asked, how do you do that? Because what do you feed them? And I said, well, one of the primary ingredients is porcine plasma. And so from the slaughter plants, they harvest the blood and they extract out the plasma proteins, and that was an ingredient in those early wean pig diets. One of the attendees said, you can't do that. And I said, what do you mean? She said, this is an organic conference. And I said, I'm not saying you should do it. I was asked, how do you get by weaning a pig that young? And I'm telling you how people get by. Her reaction was visceral enough that she left. And I felt bad. One of the other attendees there contacted me afterwards and said, would you come talk to me? Because I think we could learn from you. It's just a different approach, right? I'm a big believer that we should understand why people do what they do. And in the swine world, why does the other type of production, whoever I am, why do the other ones do this? And can we learn from that, right? Can we do something that can help us be better for our business or for the pigs, whatever? So
Absolutely. And I've heard that from a number of organic producers for a variety of species, crops, and whatever, is that you can't ignore what's going on in the commercial world because there's so many bright people in that field and you can always learn from them.
But the protein ingredients, that I think almost all the organics find acceptable. Fish meal, maybe meat and bone meal, but some don't want it to be pig. There's no health concern on that, but just philosophically.
Yeah.
And then eggs would be the next one, and then you go, well, all of the milk proteins, right? And so, of course, all of the animal proteins are more expensive than soybean meal. So,
Excellent. Well, that's really interesting. I mean, we wanted to talk about reproduction, but
yeah.
I'm always happy to talk about swine diets because it's so critical. But yeah, that's really fascinating. And I probably should mention there is difficulty in feeding animal products sometimes with the regulations. You usually have to have inspection and like actually cook the ingredients and that sort of thing. But it also reminds me, I like reading old farm books, and my bachelor's is actually in French. And so one of the first books I read was a French book that was published in the 1880s, and it listed wheat middlings and skim milk as the ideal diet for a weaned piglet.
Okay.
Which, considering what you said, makes a lot of sense now.
Yeah. 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 So the feeding of animal products, I mean, that spray-dried plasma, that's all inspected and hygienically controlled, and it's not like we're just killing pig and giving the raw blood to other pigs. But
Right. Cool.
Yeah, I fed a feed that's had porcine in it before. I didn't realize it, and again, for what I do and my brand, no thank you. But yeah, it's controlled, like you said, and it just is. It's just a personal choice at the end of the day.
yeah.
Well, I think you already answered my next question, which was why is it that they have such large litters? Is there any other factors other than the smaller placenta?
Well, so the placenta allows the embryo survival. That's the big deal.
Okay.
And they have it. So at the time they were imported, actually, they also had higher ovulation rates, so more eggs to start with than our commercial breeds. But the modern commercial female has equivalent ovulation rate now. So she's been selected for that. She doesn't have as high of embryo survival, and she doesn't have the uniformity of piglet size. So if she has a litter of 16 or 18, there's going to be some small ones and some more normal sized, right? Whereas the Meishan, when we have our litters of 16 or 18, they tend to be pretty uniform because they've gone through a long series of selection to be successful in that way.
Yeah. Did you find any difference in the males that had any impact?
Wow, that's a really good question. I don't recall reading any of that.
Okay.
The interesting thing with the male, so Meishans in general, they tend to be pretty docile pigs, but sexually, that's not necessarily the case.
We're aware of that.
Yeah, and so when I said that some of the genetic companies have some Meishans, that's actually why. Because so when we're doing artificial insemination in a barn, we use the male to stimulate the female to show that she's ready to be bred, right? And so if we do that with a conventional boar, he gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and more aggressive, and the Meishan kind of caps out at mature size that's quite a bit smaller, and he tends to be easier to get along with, and he really, when he's doing his job, he does it really well, and that's both physical as well as his pheromones, the odors.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've had a lot of folks use them as heat check bores, which that's what you're referring to, right, Tim?
Yep.
And
Yep.
what they tell me is the Meishan will make their sows stand quicker and faster than other breeds of pigs, and that there's really no comparison to a Meishan heat check bore versus other breeds. Is that the kind of the layman's terms of what you're saying? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So I have a colleague who told me that she has somebody she knew from graduate school that has a bunch of Meishan sows and is selling only heat check bores. I don't know what they're doing with the gilts, but just selling heat check bores to show pig people, because a lot of show pig people tend to have small numbers of sows, not unlike probably most of the Meishan breeders, and they may not want to have a conventional boar for the same reasons the commercial farms don't want them. Or if they get big, they can get aggressive. the Meishans tend to be really good at detection of heat, and they're easy to get along with. So
Yeah.
My
And I
vet
hear.
is my
Go
vet
ahead,
is a
John.
show pig breeder, and I actually sold him a Meishan for that reason. And he's had friends reach out to me since then, and as he explains, they've not been selected in the way that commercial pigs have, so they don't tend to produce as large of litters. There's a little bit more difficulty on that side, and
yeah,
from what he says, being able to. And the other thing is they also tend to use AI a lot.
yeah,
And from what he said, that being able to time when you do the AI makes a pretty big difference in the success.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. On the other side of that, I've also heard from other show pig breeders that the sows make excellent nurse sows. I don't know
Hmm.
what the right name is for that,
Yep.
but they'll pull them off the other breed because the Meishan simply does it better at the end of the day.
So she has a couple of things. One is she tends to have bigger nipples, but the piglets don't have a problem with it for whatever reason. But the really unique feature about the Meishan female that makes her a good nurse sow is she can, if you leave piglets on her, she'll continue to lactate. Some people get them to lactate up to 6 months,
Hmm.
and our commercial sows are they're going to dry up before that.
Hmm.
I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I've experienced that here, but I never really put that together with other breeds. Interesting.
Wow.
Another great thing about our pigs.
Yeah. Well, it's been great digging through kind of the information, but I think we'd also like to talk about maybe some advice for new breeders and
Yep.
people who. So, is there anything about these unique differences that require special care, or are they just unique differences that result in better sows?
I'd say for a new breeder, particularly a new Meishan breeder, if they've experienced other pigs, probably the thing. So I am told that they tend to be pretty good escape artists compared to other pigs. I've never raised them, so in a commercial barn that may or may not be true, but in a more extensive setting, I'm told that they jump fences a little more than others and things like that.
Hmm.
But probably the biggest thing is if they're raising intact males and females, they need to get them separated more early in life. So these pigs, I mean, in the literature, will say they'll reach puberty between 90 and 100 days. Okay, so that's about half of our conventional breeds. And so if we're raising litter mates, we probably should go ahead and separate them at weaning, and just to make sure it's done. So the first time I experienced that myself, I was in a nursery and a farm that was raising some Meishans for heat check boars, and these boars were 50 pound, and the whole nursery smelled like boars already.
Hmm.
It's like, man. And they will get pregnant at very young ages. Certainly by 90 days, you're likely to get them bred if you don't separate them.
Yeah. And that's very not ideal, right? I mean, what are some of the long term problems that could be a result of a gilt getting bred too early?
So that's another one where it's a little bit tricky to say because if we breed a conventional gilt at that age, she's going to have all kind of problems, or at a pubertal estrus. But there's not been enough data in that Meishan. So the limited ones that I know of, they've gone ahead and farrowed.
Mm-hmm.
But most of those folks are not trying to keep them for the long term. And so if we breed a conventional gilt really young, we worry more about her longevity. And her first litter tends to not be as good, right? So, but a lot of times we see that with gilt litters in general. So, and a lot of that we believe is that the colostrum is different because they've not been exposed to as many pathogens as long, and so they don't have the antibodies in the colostrum.
Hmm.
So, typically with commercial gilts, we're going to say breed them at their second or third estrus. And with Meishans, we don't have good literature to say, how much better is second or third versus first, or should it be sixth or eighth, right?
Mm-hmm.
We just don't have that in the literature, so I'm not sure I can answer that one.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, because that
I
was
could.
one of the questions about I was going to ask is when we should. And the
Yeah,
guidelines we've always given is they should probably be about 200 pounds, which is typically 8 months or older. And so I think that's more just a result of their physical size. And I think that's just a unique aspect of the breed is that you don't really pay attention to how many heats they've had because it's more
Okay.
about are they physically large enough.
And is that based on breedings of ones that were 150 pounds?
It's not. It's just rule of thumb to be safe. It's not
Yeah.
something we've really researched or have data
Yeah.
to back us. It's
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not scientific. I mean, I can certainly speak from just feedback and what I've experienced. Generally speaking, I always suggest that members are weaning at 9.5 weeks because the earliest known breeding is 10.5 weeks.
Okay.
And people ask, of course, how docile are they? And my answer is they are incredibly docile pigs and super chill. However, when they go into heat, they are equally as passionate about breeding, and so that's where you really have to watch those fences. They'll be slippery to get together. Most of us have experienced that, quite honestly, and we learn as we go. Now, if you do get a breeding that early, generally what we see is it stunts her growth. The sow never really grows out to what she could have. And they have small litters. That first litter, if they're bred on the first heat cycle, is generally 3 or 4 piglets, and they're not gonna really do a whole lot on that. And then the last thing that members have shared with me is they tend to be cranky most of their life, and I don't, that's very unscientific. But that's kind of the what the farmers are bringing back to the association experience.
So I think that's really interesting, and I'm going to see if I can find any more information on that. So the breeding companies that have them, I will be at World Pork Expo Wednesday and Thursday of this week, and I'm going to pin a couple of them down and ask them what their experience is. So they've told me that, they get a couple of them bred by accident. And so the thing with theirs, they pretty much only sell heat check boars to customers, and theirs are not pedigreed, right?
Right.
And just like their other lines, right, they have essentially purebred pigs, but they're not registered through anybody else's registry, only their own. So it's a little harder to pinpoint some of the things that you know. But yeah, they'll be willing to share that information. I'll ask them about it.
Yeah. I think we're open to all things, Meishan, that we can educate others on.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've been talking about heat cycles and that sort of thing. Can we kind of give a brief explanation of what that is, how we know when
Sure.
a sow is in heat and all of that?
Yep. So the pig has a 21-day ester cycle. So every 21 days she comes in heat, and so that would mean that she's going to ovulate, and if she doesn't become pregnant, she should repeat again in 21 days. And there's a little variation in that, but it's pretty consistent. If she gets bred and becomes pregnant, then she's going to hopefully go full term and have that litter of pigs. The best way to know is to give her boar exposure. And so the boar, most pig people have smelled a boar at some point in their life. They may wish they hadn't, but the gilts really like the smell of the boar. And so they respond. We call it pheromones, and there's human pheromones, and they're in lots of species. And the female pig is stimulated. It's called 5-alpha androstenol. It's a testosterone derivative, and so she's stimulated by that. So we can get gilts to come into puberty earlier by giving them daily boar exposure at an appropriate age, right? But we also can initiate or stimulate the lordosis, or standing response. And so if you've never seen a pig in a natural mating, when we went to artificial insemination, when I started, only about a fourth of pigs in the U.S. were bred by AI, and today we're at 99% probably. So when I started, it was a lot easier to train people because they had all seen a natural mating. Okay, and so to understand what is the standing response, well, so that female pig is walking around, she sees the boar, maybe he touches her. When she smells him, she locks up, and so they tense every muscle. And We talk about their ear popping, right? Meishan ears are too big. You're not going to see that, but it's happening. The muscles are trying to make those ears erect, right? And she has to do that because in a natural mating, the boar is going to mount her, and that whatever the weight of the boar is laying on her back while he ejaculates. And it's a several minute process. So if you get on the internet, it'll say it's 20-minute ejaculation, and that's not true, but it's a good story. But it is several minutes. And so if she doesn't stand solid like that, then she's not going to ever get bred. So she would stand solid. He mounts. He's thrusting, trying to get his penis in. And the end of his penis, I've got catheters up here that could show it, but it's kind of a corkscrew. And he's thrusting it. And if he gets through the vagina into the cervix, while she's standing, the cervix is also tensing up. So the muscles of the cervix are applying pressure to the glans penis or the end of the penis. And then he quits thrusting. He just lays there for, 3 to 5 minutes, maybe longer. If he's longer, he's probably going a second time. But, and so that is the standing response. Okay. So one of the things that we struggle with is how do we know when to breed a sow if we don't have a boar? Okay. And that's an age-old question for farms that don't have boars. And the best way is get a boar. Okay. And there's trade-offs, right? If I have 2 sows, do I also want a boar just for heat check? If I'm going to AI to somebody else's boar, and I'm not saying you need a boar, you will probably be more effective with a boar. Okay. So without it, what are a couple of options, things that we could try? If we're not too concerned with biosecurity, if we have a neighbor with boars, we can take a washcloth and go wipe it around his face while he's breeding and bring it back. And there is enough pheromone on that will help stimulate her. There are some chemical sprays to mimic the boar smell. My experience, they're not as effective. Some people say they work. My experience has not been as positive. So then we say, well, what else? We look for the secondary signs. And so if you go to the Pork Checkoff website, I can't give you more precise way to find it than that, but there's a detection of estrus poster, and it talks about this. Okay.
Pork what?
And so, pardon me?
Pork what website?
The Pork Checkoff.
Checkoff.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I think it's porkcheckoff.org. And from there, I'd have to stumble around to find the poster, but basically the vulva, which is the only part of the female's tract that you see, so every 21 days, if you look at it, it's going to grow and shrink. Okay. In a Meishan, you may have a hard time seeing it's also changing. That size is largely vascularity. And so in a white pig, you're going to see it goes from a white to light pink to a dark pink or red, right? On a Meishan with a black skin, a black vulva, you're not going to see that, right? But it will happen. And if you look, you'll see every 21 days, it's getting bigger and getting smaller, right? And it's 3-dimensional. And so we're actually doing some work with robots and cameras trying to be able to detect estrus when we don't have boars, right? And we'll see what we can do. But so typically, the day that it starts to go back down is the day she should be bred. Okay? But that's a really subjective thing, right? The other thing that happens is the vaginal mucus changes. And so during that time that it's swelling, you'll see typically more mucus discharge. Okay? And if you actually feel that mucus, it's different. Okay? So we call it the thumb check. And so if you put your finger in the vulva, you get a little mucus on it, and if it's just kind of watery, it's nothing. When it feels more like it's not as sticky as syrup, but maybe more than shampoo. So something between shampoo and honey. That's the day she needs to be bred. Okay. So if we don't have a boar, and for whatever reason we're not going to have a boar, if we can do a daily thumb check, we can actually get pretty good at the timing of insemination. So most of our farms will breed pigs twice, 24 hours apart. Okay. And so we know that the sperm cells, so they go into the cervix, or if we're using an intrauterine catheter, they go into the uterine body. But either way, the uterus takes them all the way up to the oviduct. And those sperm cells bind sperm receptors in the oviduct. They go through what's called capacitation, which is just gaining the capacity to fertilize. And they stay bound, and they get released over the next 24 hours or so. Okay. And after that, either there aren't enough cells being released or they're starting to decay. So we come in today at 8 o'clock, we bred her. We're going to come back tomorrow, and if we can get her to stand again, or if we have the right mucus consistency, we'll go ahead and breed her again. And we know one of those is probably going to sire most of the piglets, maybe all the piglets. Okay? We don't know which one necessarily.
So on my farm, and I think a lot of our breeders, we kind of just put the male and the female together and just kind of call it good.
Okay.
And in my experience with that, they tend to farrow basically like 4 months later. And I'm not tracking, can this cycle be disrupted? Do they go into heat quicker when they're introduced to a boar, or am I just really lucky in when I'm pairing them up?
So that's a really good question. So everything I said was really about artificial insemination,
Mm-hmm.
right? If we're doing a natural mating, there's kind of two approaches. One is pen mating, which is you just put them together and let nature take its course. The other is what we call hand mating, where we put them together and we watch them, and then we separate them again. And we do that every day, right? So if we do that every day, yeah, there's a lot of labor, but we know when she was bred, okay? And then so we know when to expect piglets, and depending on our life and what kind of troubles she might have and where we might put her, etc., that's more or less important. The boar is not going to disrupt her cycles. Okay? So if she has not begun cycling, or if she's gone through what we call the stale gilt syndrome, so a female pig that doesn't get bred for a long time, sometimes they quit cycling. If we treat them like a pre-pubertal gilt, and we put them with boar or whatever other stimuli that we're going to use to try to initiate puberty, we get the same sort of response. Okay? But if she's having her 21-day cycles, and if you put her in with boars, she'll get bred at the next time. So if you put her in on day 18, she'll get bred 3 days later. If you put her in at day 25, she'll get bred, I should have done the math on that, 14 days later, right? 16 days later. So the boar won't disrupt that cycle.
Well,
and so when you say,
sorry, go ahead.
Pardon me.
I didn't mean to
No, when you
interrupt
say she'll farrow about 4 months later, yeah, gestation length is about 4 months, right? So it's about 115 days. So you're pretty close to 4 months. But,
Well, so that brings up the question, because I think we've talked about this but never had great answers. You know, we talk about how young or how old a gilt should be and not breeding them too young, but can you breed them too late or too old?
yeah, so again, that's not really been looked at in the Meishan specifically, but in pigs in general. So when I mentioned stale gilt, I don't think you're going to see it commonly in Meishans simply because of where they're housed. So we didn't tend to see stale gilts as a common issue in more extensive operations. But when we put them in a barn that was the same temperature and the same photo period, et cetera, every day, that's when we tended to see that happen. So if you go too late, what is too late? And that's why I'm curious about your 240-ish days, and I'm wondering if that is too late. But you're basing it on weight, and so there's justification there. But if we put a pig, so I also work a little bit with zoos, and zoos have their species survival plans, and so what they want is they've got these specimens and they know who they're going to be bred to, but they don't want to breed them until the last minute, right? Because the extra babies, they can't use them for anything, and they can't feed them to the lions. That would be socially unacceptable. So they kind of want to wait, so they don't have extras, but they want her bred before she has gone senescent. And a lot of times they're not successful at that. I mean, it's actually one of the biggest problems with reproduction in zoos. So you've got one, you've got contraception until such time as you don't want it, and then you say, wow, she's got all kind of uterine issues now because she became this old female that had never reproduced. So yes, what is that age? I don't know. With our kind of commercial gilts, we're going to look at puberty at something in that. Now, there's some lines we're going to say 150 days, but probably between 150 and 180 days. And we want to typically breed them when they're about 210, 230 days, and that 300 plus pounds. That's kind of the generic targets for commercial pigs. So I don't think that your 200 pounds on a Meishan is bad, but I am a little concerned if they're getting puberty at 90 days and we're breeding them at 240, that we might be compromising a little bit.
So I'd love to share, again, feedback from membership on what they're breeding and how old it's going. Overall, I can say that around 4 years old, we see that some sows and some boars are done breeding. We don't know why that is. We also have boars and sows that are still breeding at 5.5 years old, right up to 6. The litter sizes get smaller, which we just assume is just an age thing. Maybe they're not ovulating as much. But that's kind of where we are. And I haven't seen or experienced myself anything that would be in the stale sow scenario.
Yeah.
Other than, I mean, there is an age, like we said, that they drop off.
Yeah.
There's also a thing amongst, Jonathan, you can help me on this. There's a general idea amongst a lot of our members, and I think it is livestock in general, that you should never breed something under a year old. My response to that is it depends on what you want out of your stock. If you're in a commercial environment, you've missed a heat cycle, you've missed litters, you're not getting the value out of the hog. Personal preference, if that's what you want to do, though, that's all good. So that's what I can share from the association. Jonathan, do you have anything?
I agree. And that's kind of what's interested me about this conversation is that my rule of thumb has been closer to 8 months. But there are people who say wait a year, but from what Tim's saying, that could be jeopardizing their longevity or as breeding animals. Do you think maybe if we bred them a little younger, we would see them productive longer, or what would that change?
So again, if we wait too long, some of them will quit cycling and either never cycle or they develop uterine issues. And there's various array of those that can happen, and I don't know specifically with Meishan what those might be. As far as longevity, as long as we get them bred, I don't think you'll compromise longevity. But if I'm saying you could breed them at, let's say I say you could breed them at 8 months, and you say not until they're a year old, then I can get one more litter out of them, just because I bred them that much earlier. Right.
I've personally bred at 5 months with no issue. Yeah. It's kind of frowned upon in the market. And I want to ask one more question. So if someone's not breeding a sow till 1 year old and then they stop breeding at that average of 4 years old, are those connected at a later? Is that what y'all are saying? Does that make sense?
So I don't think that's necessarily. There's a certain age when any animal loses its reproductive ability, and you're saying 4 years. That doesn't surprise me. So a lot of our commercial farms will have kind of a maximum parity, and so they say so they know litter size is going to be small when she's a gilt, and it goes up at second, third, fourth, fifth. By seventh parity, it's going back down. And so a lot of farms will just say after her seventh litter, we're going to get rid of her because a gilt is going to have more pigs than her anyway. Right. And I say that I'm usually on farms. If I look at their records, they've usually, even a farm that says maximum parity of 7, I can usually find sows with 10 or 11 or 12 litters. Right. And if I look at their records, they're really good sows. But it's that, the law of averages is after some number, right? And so 4 years, how many litters is that? It depends, right? So, but in commercial production, you're going to have 2 point something litters per year. So if you had 2.25, just for easy math, 4 would be 9 litters, right? So that certainly fits right in. When I was in college, most farms sold sows when they were about 3 years old. And the biological people said it was because productivity was going down, and the economists said it was because the difference between a short-term and a medium-term asset, and you could depreciate them off, and everybody was taking credit for it. But I don't know why the farmers did it, because in Oregon there wasn't a lot of pig farmers. But
Like,
Yeah, I think to speak to the breeding age, the Meishan is an ideal hog for a lot of beginning farmers. In fact, because they can be so unique, it can be a challenge for those that have done commercial things and other breeds. And I think we talked about this with Max on a podcast. Developing an eye for weight, or even a tape system set for the Meishan for people to understand what the weight is something that the association definitely needs to support and come up with some means. So in order for people to understand that the weight matters in terms of what the sow can carry, that's where some of that language has come from for us, because we feel like regardless of the multiple body types within the breed, that standard puts the sow in the best position to move forward. So there's definitely more work to be done there. Yeah. All right. Well, Jonathan, what's our next question?
well, I think we should probably cover a little bit of nutrition for the sow. How does her nutritional needs change throughout gestation, and what problems would you run into if she's, underfed or those needs aren't met?
And so I'll start this with a disclaimer: I am not a nutritionist. Okay. When I did reach out to the couple of the genetics companies that sell Meishan heat check boars, and I just kind of picked their brain, what do you think? And so in this space, they said, yeah, they're fascinating on their eating. They said, and so with our commercial sows, if they're getting 4.5 pounds a day, you put 4.5 pounds for every sow, and it's gone in 5 minutes. And they said these Meishans, not at all. They're snackers. They said you can put it out there. They won't fight over it. They'll just wait till the others are done. And they suggested that they won't overeat. And I don't know if that's true, but that was their take on it. Underfeeding is a bigger issue. And so early on, pigs kind of just need maintenance, whatever maintenance feed intake is, because even if she's growing 20 baby pigs inside her, when they're 35 days old, each is only about the size of a marble. So it just hasn't taken that much. Now, when we get up to that mid-gestation and maybe 80 days, they probably need a little bit more. Making sure that they have enough protein is really important. Making sure they have enough vitamins. And this is where I don't know that their needs are that much different than commercial pigs. So if we have a diet that is balanced for vitamins, amino acids, for commercial pigs, it's just about the amount that they're going to need. One of the things that we have a nutritionist here on faculty, Dr. Amy Petrie, her interest is, or one of her interests, she's all kinds of pig nutrition, but she really studies fiber in pig diets.
I've listened to her podcast. She's really good.
Yeah, we're really happy to have her.
Yeah.
But she's working more with commercial sort of breeds. But I think the Meishan, which we mentioned earlier, right, it has an ability to better utilize fiber as an ingredient. So as a non-nutritionist, what I've always talked about fiber for pregnant sows is because if we're feeding them 4.5 pounds and she would eat 8, if I feed her 8, she'll get so fat that she'll have problems having babies. She won't have good milk production. I mean, all kinds of problems with being too fat. But if I can give her a bunch of fiber that she can't digest, she feels better. She's satiated, right? She feels full. So the feedback I got from the one genetic supplier was that they kind of don't overeat, and they're feeding them the same diet they're feeding their commercial pigs, because they're in the same barns as their commercial pigs. So, but I think again that really when we think about our sow diets, we need to make sure we've got the right amino acids and vitamins and minerals, right? So the Meishan's not unique in that she's going to milk to feed her pigs. And if we've not given her enough calcium in the diet, she will take it from her bones, right? And if she doesn't have enough protein, now milk production will go down, but she's going to do as best as she can using her body to feed those pigs. So during lactation is probably the bigger deal. And I don't know that Meishans are any different, right? So most of our farms today we're trying to get them on full feed as quickly as we can after they farrow, right? And so that might mean that we're feeding them 3 or 4 times a day, smaller meals. Because if you just have a big pile of feed there, then the flies get on it and it gets gross and she won't eat it. But so the way I describe it, I want is when I see a farrowing feeder that there's maybe a handful of feed in it, right? If it's licked clean, then she should be given more feed. If there's cups full of feed, then it's probably dirty and she would eat more feed if it were fresh. And so typically that means we have to feed them more than once a day.
That's really interesting. That it tracks with other things I've heard. I think Max was saying that pigs that are more efficient growers, that appetite is almost always directly correlated with those traits for quicker, more efficient growth. And so it makes sense that you'd have those behavioral differences. And, when I was asking the question, I guess what I was expecting is like, if their nutritional needs aren't met, that you'll see, smaller litter sizes, lower birth weights, pigs that don't grow as efficiently. But I think you made a great point that can also sacrifice the longevity of your sow because it's going to be taking resources out of her bones, out of her muscle, and draining her bodily resources, so to speak.
Yeah. And so what we see kind of lactation feed intake, I would argue that's probably the area where it's most important, because we're asking her to grow a bunch of pigs from 2 pounds to whatever weaning weight is, right? On almost, depending on what age you're weaning, it might only be milk, right?
Yeah.
So that's all coming from either what she's eating or what her body is giving. And she will try to do that the best she can. And so if she has to use too much of her body, then she's not going to return to estrus very quickly. And if she does, she's going to have a lower ovulation rate. She's going to have lower embryo survival because the oocyte quality isn't as good. I mean, there's just lots of factors there. The gestation feeding, the thing I see most commonly is that they're fed too much. And again, I don't know with Meishans that that's as much of an issue according to the folks I've talked to. But if you feed a commercial sow too much, she will get fat. And so, fat's good insulation. And so when she goes into labor, her body can't dissipate the heat as much as it should be able to. She also has fat kind of built around her uterus, so the muscles have to work a lot harder to push the piglets out. So duration of farrowing gets extended. We have more stillborn pigs, and that fat also gets deposited in the mammary glands. And so the way milk production works, right, it's like a bunch of grapes. Each little lobule has milk in it, and when each gland is full, then it quits making milk. And if there's a bunch of fat around it, it can't get full as quickly because the fat is compressing it. So we don't have as much milk production, and then we get mastitis. I mean, it's just so overfatness is a bigger problem.
I haven't really seen that. I don't know of members that have experienced that. Other than mobility, I mean, just, the heavier they are, the harder it is to get up and move around. But I don't know of any scenarios with our members that fat has created farrowing issues, breeding issues, or nursing issues. Jonathan, have you heard of anybody with that?
No, I think underfeeding tends to be a bigger problem than overfeeding.
Yeah, I think it is too.
And so that's, again, consistent with what the genetic company told me, that they're snackers and they don't overeat, which is, that's a very unique attribute that it makes it a lot easier to feed them in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Is there, like at this pork checkoff you mentioned earlier, is there a standard out there that when do you know a sow is at a good structure or, a physical appearance to say she's ready to breed? Is that something that exists out there?
There's a lot of material on that. And so we talk about feet and leg structure, and we talk about size, and we talk about vulva development. So a pig with a small vulva, the vulva is part of the reproductive tract, right? If it's small, vagina is probably small, the uterus is probably small. She's probably going to be an inferior mother as far as litter size. Okay. The feet and legs, I think you need to throw all that away for the Meishans.
Thank you.
Their legs are just different.
Yeah.
And if you use the conventional pig standard, you'd say this pig can't walk.
Right.
And so that's probably another area you say you want to figure something out. Maybe we need to do a bunch of looking at that. So if you look at the ones for commercial pigs, I think it could be informative, right? Sure. So we look at angles. And so in general, if we think of a foot and leg like that, if you straighten your hand as much as you can and pound it into a wall, or you kind of bend it to where your fingers, so you're just giving cushion, right? But the Meishan, they've got a lot of cushion, and they've got some side angles, and actually the companies also said that. They said, yeah, we don't know what to do with their feet and legs because they just look terrible, but they don't have any problem walking on them. So
we've had this exact,
we've had members and different people say, oh, their structure is all wrong, but what we come back to is we are not having issues.
Right.
So don't change the breed if there's not an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it works, and so that's what. So I have a graduate student right now actually who is on a fellowship, the inaugural joint fellowship between Missouri's Department of Animal Science or Division of Animal Sciences and the St. Louis Zoo. And her work is in comparative reproductive biology. And so, I mentioned zoos have issues with pigs and controlling reproduction. When do we want to breed them? How do we get it when we want? So we're going to try to manipulate some of these. It's the Babirusa is what she'll be working with. So first try to define, what is their reproduction like? And then if it needed to be manipulated to fit the zoo plan, do we have tools that could do that? But first, we have to know what's the gestation length, what's the length of the estrus cycle, right? All that kind of stuff that really isn't well defined. We'll never try to make the Babirusa a commercial pig. And I think, if you want to make the Meishan a commercial pig, then it won't be a Meishan. It has its unique features, and the feet and legs are just one of those things you say, okay, they're not having problems. So the one, I'd say, physical structure issue that I think you'll say that you've heard is they get to where they hang low and drag on the ground, right? And so if you wanted to do anything, maybe you give them a little bit longer legs.
And some of them have that and some don't.
Yeah.
It just varies.
Yeah. But again, I think that is a Meishan feature, and I think that's just part of their charm.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that because we want to do right by the breed at the end of the day, and I appreciate your support. That to me it makes me feel better about where we are.
Because we've had that exact discussion a number of times with various folks.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think it's always a challenge. So I said at the beginning, I try to find. I'm one who likes to build consensus and learn from each other, and so. There's not a lot of people that serve on the board of directors with the Livestock Conservancy and their state pork producer organization or the national pork, right? But there's a lot of interest where we overlap, and in finding those areas and helping each other be successful. I'm all about that. Trying to make one be the other, that doesn't make sense. Right? Yeah. They're different for a reason, and diversity matters in the pig world. So I'm all about it.
And we see that within the Breed Association because there's, folks like Laura and I that run meat businesses. There's other people that are just producing for their family. There's people that are in between.
Yep.
Room for everybody. Yeah. All right, Jonathan, what's your next question?
Well, I think we should be getting to the point of wrapping up. We are hitting about an hour, but there is one that the trick with the Meishans is always knowing when they're bred. I had this guy that worked for a commercial pig pharmaceutical company that came out just to see the pigs, and he pointed at one and goes, I think she's bred. And I was like, sir, that's a barrow. And because of their larger bellies, it can be really hard to tell when a pig is bred. So, other than monitoring their cycles, is there a good way to to tell? Does pregnant look different than just having a big belly, or how can we kind of troubleshoot that?
Yeah, so um, pregnant does look different, but it can be subtle. And so I'll say, so I graduated high school in 1983 in Oregon.
Hmm.
And if I went to my high school reunion today, I would say, man, you guys look different. But if I had never left Oregon, I might not notice that they looked as different,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So that is a challenge for the farmer because you see your pigs every day,
Hmm.
right? And they're gradually getting different. So, with commercial pigs, when they're 60 days pregnant, so halfway through, we can tell, right? With the Meishan, yeah, might be a little trickier. But I think if you know your pigs, hopefully you can tell. There's a couple of ways. We can do blood tests, right? If you know when she cycled, so when the follicle ovulates, there's an egg comes out, and where that follicle came out, that becomes an endocrine organ, right? The corpus luteum. It produces progesterone, which is the progestational hormone, right? So about 2, 3, certainly 4 days after she first came in heat, you'll have high levels of progesterone in the blood and in the feces. Okay? And that's a monitoring thing. It's not as precise, but and then at about 15 days or so, the CL regress, and you get low progesterone. So 15, 16, 17 days. So if you kind of know when she was in heat, and you could do those multipliers, you go, well, if she has high progesterone at 21 or 42 days later, she's pregnant. Okay? Or she has a weird cycle. But you have to get a blood sample or a fecal sample, and you have to have an assay to do it. And that's not a trivial thing. So another way is ultrasound. And so most of our commercial farms, I won't say all because there's always an exception. Nearly all of them have an ultrasound machine, right? I mean, and they're in that kind of $2,000 to $3,000 range for a portable handheld, and you just got a little probe that you put in her flank, and if you get in there kind of 28 to 35 days, you'll see little black circles. And that's the placenta fluid. Within there is a tiny fetus, but it's so small that you really won't see it typically with the ultrasound. There's nothing else that is a circle that's black inside the pig. So even if you point at the wrong space, with a lot of the cheaper machines, if you point it at the bladder, you'll find that she's pregnant because it's just finding that fluid body. But when you look with real-time ultrasound, and you say that's a round circle, and the bladder's never a round circle, right?
Yeah.
So $2,000 to $3,000 is a lot of money.
Hmm.
If you got 2 or 3 pigs, is there somebody locally? Can people buy one collectively? Is there a veterinarian that offers that service? Is it worth it?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are good questions.
Yeah.
The other way,
Thankfully. Yeah.
you heat check at you come back 18 to 22 days later, and you just start looking either with looking at the vulva, doing the thumb check, or giving her bore exposure. So if you have her away and you put her together, because if she's housed with the bore, you may never know she was in heat, because that standing response, it takes every muscle in her body. And after a period of time, she gets exhausted.
Hmm.
And so if that's when you walk out there, she's not showing that she's in heat, even though she is. So in those cases, if we really want to know, we got to separate them for a couple hours. Overnight's great. Put them fence line in the morning, and she will look for the boar typically when she's in heat. And if she gets nose to nose contact, she'll stand, nearly always.
Hmm.
So ours is not an easy and cheap method,
But it sounds like you could, if like the way I do it, I put them together, and then I typically move the boar out after 2 months so that she's by herself for the last 2 months so that I can feed her better. But it sounds like you could just put the boar on the other side of the fence and watch their behavior. And that would be just kind of a cheap and easy low tech way of making sure she was bred. And if
yeah,
she's not, then you just move them back in.
yep.
Yeah. I want to ask a couple questions, and y'all can laugh at me. It's okay. Around here, if we're not sure if something's in heat, my husband can walk out there, and sometimes farm hands. Essentially, if a male walks out in the pasture, they'll lock up. Is that anything to that? I mean, I know you've got all these great scientific things, but I've actually got a great T-shirt of my husband sitting on a sow because she was standing heat, like, motorcycle. Anyhow, yeah.
So, yeah, I'll never say that that's not true
Mm-hmm.
because things happen. Okay, so we've got coming up in August the Boar Stud Managers Conference, and so it's a 2-day workshop designed for people who collect and process semen for a living. Okay, in the pig world, we do that once every 4 years, right? And inevitably, if I put a panel up there and ask them, something about, tell me some quirky story, they're going to have these two boars that Laura is the only person who can ever collect. And one day she didn't wear the same perfume and it didn't work, right?
Wow.
There's all kind of, everybody has something, or some pig is that way.
Okay. Interesting.
And we do, I will tell you things like, if we vaccinate pigs,
Uh-huh.
we either have different people vaccinate or they wear a different color clothes or something, so that we try to make them not associate that with that person if it's the same person, for example, that does semen collection.
Interesting.
So there is a lot of that. Pigs are far more perceptive of some things than we know. Why would they respond to your husband? I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
Was he the one that introduced them to the boar?
I never thought about that, but that's interesting. I'm glad I asked that.
Yeah.
All right, my other question that I have been asked, can you use a human pregnancy test if you can catch the urine? Will that work?
Let's see, I think this was done, and I don't remember what they found.
We had a member that did it and said that it worked. I don't know.
So I'm trying to remember, because the human tests are based, do you remember which hormone they're based on? LH?
I don't know, and that's kind of what I wondered, is that the hormone that it's testing for people would be different for pigs, I think. Maybe.
In general, the hormones are going to, for most of the tests, they're going to cross-react if it's the same hormone. But sometimes when they are high and low are not the same. So that's one I'd have to look up.
Okay.
I remember that's been done, but I don't remember the find. Okay. So how much does a human pregnancy test cost?
I mean, they're a couple bucks. I mean, I wish I had the picture. This member took one of those things that's the stick on it, and she duct taped a red Solo cup to the end of it.
Okay.
And she waited for the sow to get up from a nap because she knew she was going to go pee, and she captured it, put the stick in, and she said it worked. So.
Yeah. So I mean, the challenge, of course, is it's cheap, but collecting urine is not a trivial endeavor.
Right.
Yeah.
Another little fun story: I was contacted by a gentleman who had a company selling pig in heat urine to he was selling it to hunting places, and they thought it would attract boars. And so I personally don't believe it does. I know the female can smell the boar. I don't think the male. I mean, I can collect boar off a straw bale, right? If there's something that doesn't move that's the right height, I don't think smell. It's not like a lot of other species, but he had just gotten a contract with Walmart, and he said, so I need a lot of sow in heat urine. And I don't remember, he told me how many barrels of urine he wanted. And I was like, yeah, that's not something we could do. I mean, I mean, in heat, that means, even if you had them in stalls and you had a trough behind them, you'd have to have all the ones in heat, yeah,
it's not the PMU mare scenario with pigs.
Yeah. But yeah, if you've got the time to collect the urine, I'll try to look that up. It's been a long time since I remember hearing about that.
No worries. Just a random thing that I know as people listen to us, they come back and they're like, thank you for asking that. I've always wondered that. So that's what that was. All right. Jonathan, I know we're at about that. We just crossed over an hour on here. Do you have anything else that you wanted to ask? Or
No, it's been great having you. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I've learned from it as well, so I appreciate that.
I just love the conversation. Thank you for sharing again. Thank you for your time, and just thank you for working with us. It is much appreciated, and I'd love to have you back on anytime you want to be, or as things come up. Would definitely love you to continue to be a part of this journey with the Meishan.
I'd be happy to be. Look forward to it.
All right. Well, at this point, we will sign off. If y'all would hang on just a second, I've got one more question after the sign off. Again, Laura Jensen, AMBA, is where you can reach me on this one, ambamation@gmail.com. We've got more podcasts coming, sharing some more exciting stuff that we're learning about the Meishan all the time. So remember to subscribe and like these things and share them too. It does help the association, and we will see you on the next one. Y'all have a great day. Bye, y'all.
Bye.